Snow blanketed the Colorado Territory in the brutal winter of 1883, burying secrets best left hidden. A desperate family's wagon rolled onward, leaving a heavy-set young woman sitting alone on a frozen log. No provisions, no backward glances. Her only crime was an appetite they could no longer afford. The wind howling through Wolf Creek Pass sounded like the shrieks of the damned. It was November of 1883, and winter had arrived with a sudden, violent fury that caught dozens of westward travelers entirely off guard. Among them was the Montgomery family, fleeing a mountain of debt from a failed corn farm in Kansas. At the back of their battered Conestoga wagon sat Clara Montgomery. At 24 years old, Clara was a woman of substantial size. In an era that demanded delicate, fragile femininity, Clara stood 5'9" and carried well over 250 pounds. She had always been large, a physical trait inherited from a long-dead grandmother. But to her stepmother, Agnes, Clara's body was a manifestation of pure gluttony and sin. As the snow deepened, and the family's provisions of salted pork and hardtack dwindled to mere crumbs, the wagon became a powder keg of resentment. Josiah Montgomery, Clara's father, was a weak-willed man who had long ago surrendered his authority to Agnes. For weeks, Clara had endured the whispered conversations at the front of the wagon. She had heard the vicious calculus of survival being debated. "She eats the share of 3 men. Josiah," Agnes hissed one evening over a meager fire, her voice carrying through the thin canvas of the wagon. "Look at her. She has enough fat on her bones to survive a hibernation. Your youngest boy, little Thomas, is wasting away to a skeleton. If we don't shed our excess baggage, we will all perish before we reach Durango." Clara had tried to eat less. She truly had. She took only half rations, ignoring the painful hollow gnawing in her belly. But her sheer physical presence was a constant, looming reminder of the resources they lacked. To Agnes, Clara was not a daughter. She was a liability. The betrayal happened on a Tuesday afternoon. The wagon had thrown a wheel bearing, and the draft horses were blowing hard, their ribs showing starkly against their winter coats. They had managed to limp the wagon into a clearing near a collapsed, abandoned silver miner's shack. The temperature was dropping fast, plummeting well below zero. Josiah approached Clara, avoiding eye contact. His hands trembled as he handed her a small tin bucket. "Clara, girl," he mumbled, staring at the snow boots she had fashioned from old burlap sacks. "Agnes and I need to fix the axle, but we need fresh water. There's a creek about a half-mile down that ridge. Take the bucket. Wait by the water if it's frozen. I'll come down with the pickaxe to break the ice." Clara hesitated. She looked at her father, really looked at him. His eyes were completely hollow. He was a man who had already made his peace with murder. "Pa, it's near dark," she said, her breath pluming in the freezing air. "The wolves." "Just do as you're told, Clara," Agnes snapped from the driver's bench, her face wrapped tightly in a woolen shawl. "For once in your life, pull your own weight." Swallowing the lump of dread in her throat, Clara took the bucket. She trudged heavily through the knee-deep snow, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. It took her nearly 40 minutes to navigate the steep, treacherous ridge. When she finally reached the creek, she found it frozen solid. She sat on a fallen, ice-crusted log, wrapping her threadbare wool coat tighter around her broad shoulders. She waited. 1 hour passed. Then 2. The sun dipped below the jagged peaks of the San Juan Mountains, plunging the forest into a deep, bruising purple twilight. The temperature dropped so fast it felt like a physical blow. Clara blew into her cupped hands, her teeth chattering so violently she bit her own tongue. "Pa?" she called out. The wind swallowed her voice instantly. Panic, cold and sharp, finally pierced through her denial. She scrambled up the ridge, her heavy boots slipping on the icy rocks. Her lungs burned with every breath. When she finally crested the hill and stumbled into the clearing, the truth hit her with the force of a runaway train. The clearing was empty. The wagon was gone. Only a set of deep, rutted tracks remained. leading westward, already filling rapidly with fresh, blowing snow. They had left her. Her own flesh and blood had calculated the odds, weighed her life against their convenience, and discarded her to the mercy of the Rocky Mountain winter. Clara fell to her knees, the icy snow seeping through her coarse skirts. She didn't cry. The cold was too absolute to waste moisture on tears. She crawled toward the collapsed miner's shack, seeking any shelter from the biting wind. It was merely 3 walls of rotting pine and a caved-in roof. She curled her large body into the tightest corner she could find, pulling pieces of rotting timber over herself. As the night wore on, the agony in her extremities faded into a dangerous, seductive numbness. The freezing process is a cruel trickster. Clara began to feel a strange, radiant warmth blossoming in her chest. Her mind drifted to memories of Kansas summers, the smell of baking bread, the feeling of the sun on her face. She closed her eyes, surrendering to the heavy, peaceful sleep of hypothermia. Wyatt Callahan did not like people. At 38 years old, he had spent the last decade ensuring he interacted with humanity as little as absolutely necessary. A former scout for the cavalry, Wyatt had seen enough blood, greed, and treachery to last him 3 lifetimes. Now he lived high up in the San Juan Range, making his living trapping ermine, fox, and beaver, trading his pelts once a year in the rough-and-tumble town of Pagosa Springs. Wyatt was a giant of a man, standing 6'4", with a thick beard and eyes the color of chipped flint. The locals in the valley called him the Beast of the San Juans, spinning wild rumors that he ate raw wolf meat and consorted with spirits. Wyatt encouraged the rumors. They kept trespassers away from his pristine, isolated valley. It was the morning after the great blizzard, and Wyatt was out checking his western snare line on snowshoes. The world was a blinding, brilliant white, silent save for the crunch of his steps. As he neared the ruins of the old Silver Claim, his lead sled dog, a massive Malamute mix named Barnaby, suddenly halted and began whining, digging frantically at a massive snowdrift near the collapsed shack. "Leave it, Barnaby. It's just a dead elk," Wyatt grunted, adjusting his rifle sling. But the dog barked sharply, refusing to move. Wyatt sighed, trudging over and using his snowshoe to kick away the top layer of the drift. He stopped dead. It wasn't an elk. It was a patch of faded blue calico fabric. Wyatt dropped to his knees, using his thick, leather-gloved hands to furiously dig through the packed powder. He uncovered a woman. She was massive, larger than any woman he had ever seen, curled into a tight, frost-covered ball. Her skin was a terrifying shade of blue-gray, her lips cracked and rhymed with ice. Wyatt pressed his bare ear to her chest. He waited, holding his own breath. Thump. A agonizingly long pause. Thump. She was alive. Barely. Wyatt's mind raced. Any ordinary slender woman would have frozen to the marrow hours ago in these temperatures. But this woman's sheer mass, the very thing that had likely made her a social outcast, had provided a crucial layer of insulation around her vital organs, keeping the faint ember of her heart burning through the night. Moving her was a monumental task. Wyatt had to maneuver his wooden freight sled directly alongside her. Using every ounce of his formidable strength, he rolled her heavy, unconscious form onto the sled, strapping her down tightly beneath a pile of heavy bear hides. "Mush!" he roared to his dogs, cracking his whip in the air. The 2-mile journey back to his secluded, reinforced log cabin was a race against the Grim Reaper. Once inside, Wyatt didn't hesitate. He stoked the iron belly of his stove until it glowed cherry red. He knew the rules of extreme frostbite. Warming her too quickly would send her heart into fatal shock. He worked methodically, stripping away her frozen, rigid outer garments, taking care to preserve her modesty by covering her with a heavy wool blanket as he worked. He packed her frozen fingers and toes in cool, not hot water to slowly coax the blood back into the capillaries. For 3 days and 3 nights, Clara hovered on the precipice of death. She burned with a sudden, violent fever, thrashing violently in Wyatt's oversized bed. Wyatt barely slept, forcing drops of warm willow bark tea and rich bone broth past her chapped lips. On the afternoon of the fourth day, Clara's fever broke. She opened her eyes, gasping loudly as the searing pain of returning circulation hit her extremities. She stared up at a ceiling made of massive, hand-hewn logs. The smell of wood smoke and roasting meat filled the air. "You're awake." Clara flinched violently, pulling the heavy elk hide up to her chin. In the corner of the cabin sat Wyatt, sharpening a massive hunting knife on a whetstone. To Clara, still half delirious, he looked like a monster, wild hair, broad shoulders, a scar cutting through his left eyebrow. Where am I?" Her voice was a raspy whisper. "Where is my pa?" Wyatt didn't look up from his knife. "Your pa left you to die in a blizzard. Found you under 4 feet of snow by the old silver claim. Name's Wyatt." The blunt, brutal truth hit Clara like a physical blow. The memories came flooding back. The tin bucket, the frozen creek, the empty clearing. A choked sob escaped her lips. She looked down at herself, realizing she was dressed in a massive, oversized flannel shirt that clearly belonged to the mountain man. Instantly, a new, darker terror gripped her. She was alone in the wilderness with a strange, rugged man. She knew how women were treated on the frontier. She knew her own lack of conventional beauty, usually invited either disgust or cruel mockery, but out here, lawlessness reigned. "What do you want from me?" Clara demanded, her voice trembling but defiant. She tried to sit up, groaning as her muscles screamed in protest. "If you think I'm going to be your slave, or—" Wyatt finally looked up. His flinty eyes locked onto hers, completely unreadable. He stood up, towering over the bed, holding a steaming wooden bowl. Clara braced herself, shutting her eyes tightly. "Eat," Wyatt said gruffly. Clara opened her eyes. He was holding out a bowl of rich, dark venison stew, thick with wild carrots and potatoes. Clara stared at the bowl, her mouth watering uncontrollably, but shame held her back. I eat too much," she whispered, echoing the venomous words of her stepmother. "I'll eat you out of house and home. You'll throw me out when you see." Wyatt set the bowl on her lap. He leaned in, his voice surprisingly soft, a deep rumble that vibrated in her chest. "Lady, I've got a root cellar packed to the ceiling with elk, bear, and salted fish. I trap for a living. I ain't never seen a human being survive a night in the open during a San Juan blizzard. It's a miracle of God you ain't a block of ice. So you eat. You eat until you're strong." Clara took the wooden spoon with trembling fingers. As she took the first bite, the rich, savory heat spreading through her starved body. Tears finally spilled hot and fast down her cheeks. Wyatt turned his back to give her privacy, walking over to his heavy winter coat hanging by the door. He reached into the pocket and pulled out a crumpled, damp piece of parchment. He had found it pinned to the inside of Clara's frozen coat when he was unbuttoning it. He hadn't shown it to her yet. The note was written in a hurried, terrified scrawl. It read, "To whoever finds this carcass. Her name is Clara. The O'Driscoll boys are tracking us for a debt of $500. If they find her, tell them we left her as payment. Tell them she's strong enough to work the mines. Just let the rest of us go." Wyatt crushed the paper in his massive fist, throwing it directly into the roaring fire. He watched the cruel words turn to ash. He didn't know who the O'Driscolls were, and he didn't care. As he looked back over his shoulder at the large, weeping woman eating his stew, a fierce, primal instinct settled over him. An instinct he hadn't felt since before the war. She was in his territory now, and the beast of the San Juans protected what was his. As the brutal winter of 1883 bled into the unforgiving months of early 1884, the isolated cabin, high in the San Juans, became a sanctuary of unexpected warmth. Clara's physical recovery was astonishing, a testament to the sheer, stubborn resilience of her body. Once she regained her footing, the true dynamic of their coexistence began to shift. Clara Montgomery was not a woman built for idle hands, and she refused to be a burden to the man who had pulled her from a snowy grave. She took over the cabin's domestic duties with a fierce determination. But out here, domestic duties did not mean delicate needlepoint. It meant hauling massive frozen logs from the woodpile, a task Clara managed with surprising ease, her broad, powerful shoulders bearing weights that would have crippled a slighter woman. She hoisted buckets of water from the ice-crusted creek, processed the heavy hides Wyatt brought in, and rendered down animal fat for candles and soap. Wyatt watched her from the periphery, his flinty eyes softening with a quiet, profound respect. He had spent his life around fragile women who wilted under the harsh sun and broke under the mountain's demands. Clara was different. She was an absolute force of nature. When she baked sourdough bread or roasted a haunch of venison, the cabin filled with a sense of home that Wyatt hadn't experienced since he was a boy in Missouri. One evening in late March, as the winds howled a final, desperate winter tune outside the thick log walls, Wyatt sat by the hearth repairing a broken snowshoe. Clara was mending his heavy wool coat, her large fingers surprisingly deft with a needle. "You've been quiet today, Clara," Wyatt rumbled, not looking up from his rawhide lacings. Clara paused, staring into the flickering flames. "I was thinking about my family, about Kansas. I know I shouldn't, considering what they did. But I wonder if they made it to Durango." Wyatt set the snowshoe down. He walked over to a heavy oak chest at the foot of his bed, unlocking it with an iron key. He pulled out a bolt of deep crimson wool fabric, an expensive rare trade item he had acquired from a peddler in Pagosa Springs 2 years prior, waiting for a purpose. He walked over and set the heavy cloth in Clara's lap. "Make yourself a proper dress," Wyatt said gently. "Your family ain't your family no more. The mountains claimed you. You belong here now." Clara looked at the rich fabric, her eyes welling with tears. For her entire life, her size had been a source of shame, a monstrous defect to be hidden beneath drab burlap-like sacks. To be given something so beautiful, so vibrant, felt like an unmerited grace. "I'll need a lot of it," she whispered, a self-deprecating habit she hadn't quite broken. "I'm a big woman, Wyatt." Wyatt stepped closer, his large, calloused hand reaching out to gently tilt her chin up. "You are exactly the size you need to be to survive this world, Clara. Don't ever apologize for taking up space in my cabin." It was the most romantic thing anyone had ever said to her. In the quiet isolation of the mountains, a deep, unspoken bond forged itself between the giant mountain man and the outcast woman. But down in the valleys, the spring thaw was melting the snow, uncovering the frozen secrets of the past. In early April, trouble arrived in the form of Cletus and Bo O'Driscoll. The notorious debt-collecting brothers had tracked the Montgomery family's ill-fated wagon rut by rut. They had found the grisly conclusion to Josiah and Agnes's journey at the bottom of a sheer ravine near Wolf Creek Pass. The wagon had slipped on black ice, plunging the family to a shattered, frozen demise. But the O'Driscolls were thorough men. They checked the bodies. They realized the eldest daughter, the one promised as collateral for Josiah's $500 gambling debt, was missing from the wreckage. Following the old tracks back to the abandoned silver claim, Cletus O'Driscoll, a wiry man with a face scarred by smallpox and a heart as black as coal, spotted the faded, unmistakable runners of a heavy freight sled leading higher up into the treacherous peaks. "Looks like our payment didn't freeze after all, Bo," Cletus sneered, spitting a stream of dark tobacco juice into the slushy snow. "Somebody hauled the fat cow up the ridge. Let's go collect." It was a crisp, brilliantly sunlit Tuesday morning when the uneasy peace of the mountain was finally shattered. Wyatt had departed before dawn, trekking 3 miles down the western ridge to check a complex beaver dam that had been giving him trouble. He left Clara alone at the cabin to tend to the smoking racks of cured venison and bear meat. Stepping out onto the sturdy wooden porch, Clara wore the deep crimson dress she had so painstakingly sewn. The rich wool fit her beautifully, tailored to her formidable size, granting her a regal, imposing silhouette against the stark, rustic backdrop of the wild frontier. For the first time in her 24 years, she felt a profound sense of belonging. Then the dogs began to go wild. Barnaby, The massive lead sled dog let out a deep, guttural snarl, the thick hackles on his spine standing straight up in a rigid, menacing line. Down the tree line, cutting through the melting snowdrifts, two riders emerged. Their horses were blowing hard, coats lathered with freezing sweat from the steep, punishing incline. Clara's blood ran completely cold. She recognized the men instantly. They were the very specters from the terrified, whispered arguments of her father back in Kansas. The O'Driscolls. "Well, looky here," Cletus O'Driscoll called out, his voice dripping with a cruel, oily satisfaction. He dismounted his weary roan stallion, his boots crunching heavily in the icy mud, and casually drew his Colt revolver. "I'll be damned if you don't look healthier than a prized heifer. Your daddy owed us a lot of money, Clara. $500, to be exact. He left a note pinned to a tree saying you'd be willing to work off his debts in the silver mines down in Silverton." Clara's knuckles turned white as she gripped the rough-hewn timber of the porch railing. "My father is a miserable coward, and I owe you absolutely nothing," she shouted, her voice booming across the clearing with a sudden authoritative resonance that surprised even her. Bo O'Driscoll chuckled darkly, remaining in his saddle as he slowly uncoiled a thick length of hemp rope from his saddle horn. "It ain't about what you think you owe, girl. It's about what we're here to take. Get your hands tied and get to walking. We ain't got all day, and I ain't keen on freezing my toes off for a piece of excess baggage." Clara did not scream. She did not faint or weep. The old Clara, the frightened, starved, and beaten-down girl crying in the back of a canvas wagon, had perished in the brutal November blizzard. The woman currently standing on the porch was a hardened survivor of the San Juan Mountains. Moving with a speed that belied her massive frame, she lunged backward, slamming the heavy oak door shut and dropping the thick, iron-reinforced crossbar into place just a fraction of a second before Cletus's boots hit the wooden porch steps. "Break it down!" Cletus roared, furious at the unexpected defiance. The two outlaws began throwing their combined weight against the heavy timber, the door shuddering violently under the repeated impacts. Inside the dim cabin, Clara's heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. Her eyes darted frantically around the room. She reached up and grabbed Wyatt's secondary weapon, a double-barreled shotgun resting above the stone mantel, but her hands were shaking so terribly she fumbled the heavy brass shells, dropping them onto the floorboards. Outside, a sudden, terrifying silence fell over the clearing. The battering stopped. Then, a sound like a thunderclap cracked through the crisp mountain air. Bo O'Driscoll let out a blood-curdling scream of pure agony. Wyatt had returned, having heard the frantic, echoing barks of his sled dogs rolling down the valley. Wyatt had abandoned his traps, dropped his heavy pack, and sprinted the entire 3 miles uphill through the treacherous, melting snow. He emerged from the dense tree line like a vengeful spirit of the forest, his heavy Winchester rifle smoking in his large hands. Without a word of warning, he had fired, shooting Bo precisely through the right kneecap and dropping the outlaw violently into the muddy snowbank. "Who the hell are you?" Cletus yelled, spinning around in a blind panic and firing wildly into the thick evergreens. His bullets merely splintered the bark of the ancient pine trees, missing the mountain man entirely. "I'm the beast of the San Juans," Wyatt's voice boomed from the dark shadows of the timber, deep and laced with lethal promise. "And you are trespassing on my land." Cletus, quickly realizing he was hopelessly outmatched by an unseen, expert marksman, made a desperate, cowardly play. He spun toward the cabin, kicked out the fragile front window, sending a shower of jagged glass flying inward, and vaulted over the wooden sill to take Clara hostage. He landed heavily on the wooden floorboards, instantly raising his Colt revolver toward the large woman in the crimson dress. "Tell him to stand down out there, or, I swear to God, I'll blow your head off," Cletus screamed, his face pale with terror and rage. But Cletus O'Driscoll had drastically underestimated his opponent. Clara did not cower in the corner. Using the incredible physical strength she had built over the grueling winter strength, born from chopping wood, hauling water, and surviving the impossible, she gripped the handle of Wyatt's heavy, cast-iron cooking skillet with both hands. With a fierce, primal yell, Clara swung the massive piece of iron in a brutal, sweeping arc. The heavy skillet connected solidly with the side of Cletus's head with a sickening, definitive crack. The outlaw's eyes instantly rolled back into his skull. His gun clattered harmlessly to the floor, and he collapsed into a useless, unconscious heap, entirely unaware of what had hit him. Less than 5 seconds later, Wyatt kicked the front door open, his rifle raised and ready, his broad chest heaving with exertion. He stopped dead in his tracks. The cabin was a chaotic mess of shattered glass and splintered wood, but Clara stood victorious in the very center of the room. The iron skillet was still gripped tightly in her white-knuckled hands, her chest rising and falling heavily with adrenaline. Wyatt looked down at the unconscious outlaw bleeding on his rug, then slowly raised his eyes to Clara. A slow, incredibly proud grin spread across his weather-beaten, scarred face. He lowered his Winchester. "I reckon you had it handled," Wyatt said, his rough voice thick with an overwhelming admiration. Clara finally dropped the skillet. The heavy thud seemed to break the spell. Her tough, defensive facade finally cracked, and she rushed forward, throwing herself into Wyatt's massive, welcoming arms. He held her incredibly tight, dropping his rifle to wrap both arms around her broad waist, burying his face in her dark hair. He was suddenly overwhelmed by the terrifying realization of how close he had come to losing the only light in his solitary life. "They wanted to take me away," Clara sobbed into his chest, her fingers clutching the thick fabric of his coat. "They wanted to put me in the mines." "Nobody takes what's mine," Wyatt whispered fiercely into her ear. He pulled back slightly, his flinty eyes locking onto hers with absolute, unwavering certainty. "Clara Montgomery, I ain't a man of fancy words or grand gestures, but this mountain feels entirely empty when you're not on it. I want you to stay, not as a stray I pulled from the snow, and not just to bake my bread. I want you to stay as my wife." Clara looked up at the rugged, scarred mountain man who had given her a second chance at life, and showed her what true worth meant. She did not hesitate for a single second. "Yes, yes, Wyatt." 2 days later, after securely binding the O'Driscoll brothers and loading them onto the heavy freight sled, Wyatt and Clara made the long journey down the mountain into the bustling town of Pagosa Springs. They turned the outlaws over to Sheriff Amos Cutler, collecting a handsome bounty that would keep them well supplied for years. But their business wasn't finished. They stood together before Judge Henry Lovell in the quiet back room of the town's small wood-framed courthouse. Clara wore her crimson dress proudly, her head held high, ignoring the curious stares of the townsfolk. When the judge finally pronounced them husband and wife, Wyatt pulled her close and kissed her with a fierce, possessive tenderness that left absolutely no doubt in anyone's mind. Clara was no longer a discarded outcast. She was the undisputed queen of the San Juans, fiercely loved, proudly protected, and finally, truly home. If Clara and Wyatt's incredible tale of frontier survival and mountain justice kept you on the edge of your seat, hit that like button. Don't forget to share this Wild West story with your friends, and subscribe to our channel for more thrilling, real-life historical dramas. Have you ever faced a betrayal that made you stronger? Drop a comment below and let us know. Turn on notifications so you never miss an adventure.